Hi, my name is Dr Judith Roberts, and it gives me great pleasure to be talking to you today as part of the Masters in Counselling Conference for 2021. I'm a lecturer in the School of Psychology at Bangor University, as well as being Director of the Masters in Clinical and Health Psychology. I'm also a practicing clinical psychologist, and my talk today is going to be looking at using mindfulness for people with learning disabilities who have anger or aggressive behaviour presentations. Now, before I go on to talk about, the central topic, I really want to sort of talk about what a learning disability is defined as, but also terminology. So you'll see in the literature that typically it's either learning disability or intellectual disability, and generally they mean the same thing. Learning disability is the term that is generally used within UK health and social care settings. It's used in Department of Health documents, and it's the term that I will be using for the talk today. Intellectual disability is more often used in US settings, but the diagnostic criteria I will be talking about today sort of relates to both terms. Now, the example I have here of the diagnostic criteria is specific to the National Institute of Health and Social Care, which is an organisation that informs the NHS. But, the World Health Organization, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5 also have versions of this particular diagnosis. There are three main criteria. The first one is IQ, intelligence quotient. Now, this is a standardized score that indicates mental ability across a range of cognitive domains, and it's used to sort of identify intelligence across the general population. Okay, now I could sit here for many hours talking about the validity of IQ and whether it should or shouldn't be used as a diagnosis tool. But, for learning disability, it is very much part of the diagnostic criteria. And typically it's an IQ of below 70 that is that cutoff mark. Now, the general population sits between an IQ of 85 and 115, and 68% of the population tend to sit between those two figures. Now, you might be asking, well, what if somebody has an IQ of 75? Well, I mean, I think services these days are very much looking holistically at an individual. And so, somebody who's having a bad day might score less than somebody who isn't. And given the importance of this particular diagnosis in terms of accessing support and care, clinical teams are very much geared towards looking at things more openly than sticking to that 70 criteria. The second aspect of diagnosis is impairments in social or adaptive functioning. So from a social perspective, it's things like putting yourself in another's position, being able to see things from another point of view. Adaptive function is things like filling in forms, managing money, being able to map out a bus route. It's the things that helps us live our lives. And the third important part of diagnosis is that these difficulties have been present since childhood. Okay, so we have a fair idea of what a learning disability is. Now, the idea for this project was born back in 2012. And it occurred primarily because of a conference that was held between Betsy Cadwallader, the Learning Disability and Autism Research Network, and Bangor University for people with learning disabilities. And at this conference, there were various talks about different topics. And one of those talks was on mindfulness. Now, there was a great deal of interest shown in this conference on mindfulness and, you know, its accessibility for this particular population. And a lot of the reason for that, I think, is that learning disability traditionally is something where clinicians will, you know, change the environment, will do something, as opposed to it being owned by the individual who has the learning disability. So from a person-centered perspective, you know, mindfulness is something that non-learning disabled people can use, which is also acceptable to the learning disability population. It's something for them. It's something they can sort of adopt as an approach to make their lives better. So there was a great deal of interest from that perspective. But attendees also voiced, you know, they do have concerns about regulating emotions, and the fact that when they get angry or when they have those strong emotions, that their reactions can cause a great deal of problems in their lives and the lives of those close to them. So it was about having something that could be theirs, but also having something that could help with emotional regulation. And it, you know, research certainly shows that for people with learning disabilities, you know, around 20% tend to engage in some form of challenging behaviour, and this includes aggressive behaviour towards the self and towards objects and towards others. Now, it's particularly harmful, of course, from the obvious perspective, towards the individual, other people and the environment, but it also leads to limited access to health and community services. And of course, you know, people's housing situations can break down, people miss out on key activities or work placements because of these difficulties. So it's an issue, you know, that is really important to look at and to explore further. So the group that developed this particular piece of research, this sort of protocol, if you like, specifically looked at one particular style of mindfulness practice, which is known as soles of the feet, and that will become obvious as I explain what that is. So, you know, there have been many adaptations made to different interventions for people with learning disabilities, but this particular approach has shown, you know, significantly positive results in the US. And so it was something that, you know, the team felt would be a great focus for this UK-centred project. Now you'll see the reference on this slide, and Singh and colleagues, you know, they've written a lot about this particular mindfulness practice, and the reference that's on this slide actually describes it in detail. Okay, so I'm giving you a brief overview here, and if I was sat with you in person, I'd probably do the practice with you so you could get a feel for it. However, as this is pre-recorded, I will just give you a brief overview. So it's a very straightforward, simple practice. You begin by sitting comfortably. I mean, there's more to it than this, but, you know, the central tenet is about thinking or imagining a situation that made you feel angry. And whilst you're experiencing those imagined angry emotions, that you immediately shift your attention to the soles of the feet. And if you're listening to this now, you know, have a go at doing that, and you know, think about how easy or how difficult it is to actually do that to your attention when you're not feeling particularly happy. And then there's this continuation of the focus on the soles of the feet. And for those of you who are quite familiar with mindfulness practices, you know, it's about staying in the present moment. It's noticing thoughts and feelings and negative emotions, but not engaging with them. Okay, so soles of the feet encompasses those ideas. And the idea is that with practice, the individual can adopt this particular practice when they begin to notice those angry feelings or are in a situation where they know it might trigger those feelings. So, you know, it's a very straightforward practice. And as I said, it's something that everyone can pick up fairly easily. Now, as I said, you know, this has been used extensively in US settings, and there's a lot of, you know, positive research on the use of it in those particular settings. But the primary research objective for the group I was involved with was to develop a protocol for UK settings. Okay, now the UK NHS settings are very different to what you might find elsewhere. So we had to think about how best to develop something that encompasses the feet, but did it in a way that was, you know, easily taken on board by services in terms of cost, ease, training, and all those factors that come into play when we talk about the use of particular interventions. Now, the feasibility study was all about looking at, is this an acceptable way of delivery? Do people who work in services find it useful? Are we able to find people to participate in this? You know, once people start taking part, do they not carry on with it? And all those feasibility type topics were the focus of this research. Now, of course, we did include measures of, you know, how effective it was and measures of anger and anxiety and depression as well. But primarily we were looking at how easy or difficult it was to develop this, you know, so that we could then proceed into a protocol that could be used as part of a randomized controlled trial to really expand on this and get that evidence base going. So we named the project UMA, okay, so using mindfulness for anger and aggression. That was the acronym that we used, basically. Now, this differed to the US sort of soles of the feet protocol in 3 key ways, okay? So we had a manual, okay, which helps with people following the same process, so every clinician uses the same process. And that was designed to inform delivery of a 6-week intervention where there were one-to-one sessions. We also added educational components on feelings, emotions, specifically anger, aggression, and also, you know, explanations about what mindfulness is so that it's far more accessible. And finally, we also incorporated materials that people could use outside of those weekly sessions, such as, you know, having a CD for home practice, mindfulness skills. We were quite creative with this. You know, if somebody didn't have a CD player, we'd have a sound file that they could play on a digital format. So we sort of were able to develop this protocol and to have these materials and to really measure what worked and what didn't work as well. So the intervention itself, as I said, it was weekly over a 6-week period. Each session was 90 minutes. Now, you know, for people with learning disabilities, having to pay attention for a lengthy period of time, you know, 90 minutes for any one of us is going to be a long time, but within that there were regular short breaks as well, which is why it's 90 minutes as opposed to it being full of content for that time. Now, we wanted to make sure that the carer, and this could be paid carers or family member carers, were involved as well, so they could support the individual with these practices at home. And it's also been found to be effective for carers in helping them with their emotions and, you know, helping them be able to deal with difficult situations and feelings as well. So the sessions were focused on the posture and breathing, so the elements of this particular mindfulness practice. They also contained these educational components. There was also a file for homework activities as well that the individual could take away with them. The CDs were incorporated as part of those workbooks, and it was all adapted to the understanding of the participant. Now, of course, you know, I've talked about the diagnosis of a learning disability and this cutoff of an IQ of 70, but there's a wide range of abilities, and, you know, to engage in Soles of the Feet, the person had to have the ability to engage in these sessions and be able to practice this without too much difficulty. But even for those individuals who were able to take part, there was a huge variation in their understanding of different aspects. And that was part of the research as well, looking at, okay, which bits are really tricky for most people and which bits are fairly straightforward. So we were measuring these factors as we went along. And you've got an example here of some of the materials that we used. So on the left, you'll see the text that we had on a laminated sheet on what mindfulness is. And we adapted this so that it was very accessible, that it was very concrete, because people with learning disabilities find it quite difficult to hold on to abstract concepts. And, you know, mindfulness is one of the most abstract concepts in terms of going beyond the obvious of being present in the moment. You know, it's all about non-judgment and so on and so forth. So as a group, we came together, we discussed what mindfulness is, and this is what we produced to kind of illustrate that. And this is one of many worksheets that we had. You'll see the snow globe as well, and this was a really important aspect on putting across that concrete idea of mindfulness. Each participant had a snow globe. We put a picture of them within that snow globe with the idea that when they're still, they can see themselves, but when they shake that snow globe, they lose sight of themselves. You know, illustrating this idea that when you're still, you're better able to tune into what's going on for you at that moment, and you're not just reacting to the situation. So these were really important aspects of the work that we did. So here you'll see the actual mindfulness manual that we used. There was this manual for the clinician, and we had a workbook for the individual. And it was split up into these sessions. So, you know, we guided the clinician in a lot of detail on what they should do each session. And, you know, this was to make sure that they had the material they needed, that they were guided, but also that each and every clinician trained in this approach undertook the same activities and the same format. Okay, and this was all to do with fidelity. And when we're talking about an evidence-based intervention, it's about making sure that the evidence is based on something that everybody does in the same way. So a secondary research objective was a measure of mindfulness. You know, for people with learning disability, we didn't find any sort of questionnaires or any measure of how to measure this construct of mindfulness in this population. And of course, as I've said, one of the difficulties is the sort of the cognitive ability you need to look at this abstract construct. So we developed a mindfulness scale specifically for this population. And I want to make the point that somebody might say, well, what about mindfulness measures for children? Well, you know, it's not about having childlike language. It's about having language that is clearly communicated in a concrete way. And that's a very different thing, okay? This is an example of the actual mindfulness questionnaire. It was very simplistic. It was, you know, we wanted to make sure that we covered all aspects of mindfulness in terms of being non-judgmental, noticing, and awareness and so on and so forth, but to make it as accessible as possible. I'll come back to the outcomes for that in a minute because it's really interesting. So it was a single group study. We had 20 participants because it was a feasibility study, and we took measurements before the start, after the 6 weeks, and 6 months after the start as well. Participants had to be over the age of 18. They had to be diagnosed with a learning disability and have clinically significant difficulties with anger as assessed by their clinician. It was also necessary for them to be able to give informed consent as well, and also to have a family member or paid carer that had supported them for a significant length of time and knew them well and were able to support them with home practice. So in terms of outcomes, as a feasibility study, we had a really high recruitment rate. Lots of people wanted to take part, and feedback was that clinicians welcomed having something concrete that they could do with the people they worked with, and not just firefight situations that came up. Retention was good. This showed that when people started the intervention, they stuck with it. And adherence as well. Again, it's about starting the intervention and carrying on. Although the effectiveness of the intervention wasn't a primary aim, there were improvements in anger and aggressive behaviour, improvements in depression and anxiety. Now, the mindfulness measure that we put together and developed was not found to be appropriate at all. I think looking back, it was a bit too simplistic. It was really difficult to understand what was being asked. And the answers that we received were very much literal. So, when we asked people, are you hot or are you cold? They were sort of focusing on that as opposed to focusing on the awareness of being hot or cold. And now looking back, I'm thinking, well, that's obvious. But at the time when you're putting together these materials, it can be quite difficult to see that in real clarity. And there was also acquiescence as well, okay? A feature of people with learning disabilities, lots of people, but specifically with this population, is acquiescence, where because, of learning that giving a yes response results in far more positive reinforcement than saying no. When asked a question, even in a research sort of setting, even understanding that it's research, the tendency is to say yes to everything. So it's something that has to be considered when working with people with learning disabilities. Now, on this final slide, I've got some key references that you might find useful. The first reference relates to the project group and Gemma Griffith, who works for the Centre of Mindfulness Research and Practice at Bangor, and was a key sort of member of the research team. She took the qualitative data that we had, and it's really interesting to have a look at the qualitative feedback that was given in terms of the benefits that arose from Soles of the Feet for this population. And then the feasibility study was published last year, and the reference is there if you have any interest. Do get in touch if you have any questions. I'd be happy to help. And I think the key message that I want to give at the end of this talk is that, even though this was specific for people with learning disabilities, in therapeutic settings, we come across many different people who might have hidden disabilities or be in situations that the typical way of working with somebody might not be the best way to go, and that adaptation, can be useful, creativity can be useful, but ultimately it's about working with that individual to find out what's best for them. So I want to say thank you for listening, I've enjoyed putting this talk together. I am going to stop now and wish you all well and enjoy the rest of the conference.